Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Mess. So, we're going to have a completely different type of video for you guys today because we're going to be taking a look at the game Horses. If you haven't heard yet, this has been very topical in the news because about 24 hours ago, it was banned on basically every online platform out there outside of the Humble Store. And the question is, why was it banned? Should it have been banned? And we're going to be taking a look at all of that and more today. And this is going to be a very different type of video than you're used to on Video Game Esoterica, but it is going to be subject matter that is near and dear to my heart as both a working filmmaker of 22 years as well as an MFA holder in cinematography, direction, and the history of cinema. But before we get too far involved, I'm going to give you a little bit of a disclaimer here. Go ahead and watch for 15 seconds, and then we'll get into all the fun. Now, just so you are aware, I'm going to upload a full gameplay playthrough of this onto my Patreon just because some of the subject matter within Horses I wasn't sure about actually uploading. So I'm going to be showing you about as much as I think I can within this YouTube video while still staying on the right side of the fence, pun very much intended for Horses, when it comes to actual content guidelines here. But as far as what Horses is, if I had to put it into a single genre, it is obviously a first-person walking simulator. But what it is trying to do is tell a story through a very interesting visual medium. Right off the top, you're going to see that it is in black and white and in 4:3, and you're going to have interstitial titles for basically all of the dialogue. And just so you know, there are interstitial titles as well as just things called intertitles. Technically, you can interchange them, but interstitial is the one that I would always discuss. This game is going to play around with some very unique and interesting themes, including the concepts of misophonia, that idea of certain noises, chewing, scratching nails on chalkboards can cause people abject pain and even put them into a sense of rage. So if that is something you do not like, this game might not in fact be for you. But the main reason I'm talking about this is twofold. One, I am of the opinion that 99.9% of all games out there do not deserve to be banned or removed from online platforms. When I teach my college students the concept of film production, I tell them one very specific thing. You are allowed to make whatever you want. I will advocate for your ability to make that, but you need to explain and defend the reason you've done it, and it has to be from an educated, enlightened standpoint. Do not try to push boundaries. Do not try to push the envelope just for the shock value without some sort of defense of the work behind it. So long as my students would be able to defend their work, then I would defend them to anybody, including the administration, as to why they were allowed to make it in the first place. That is something I firmly believe in, and when it comes to gaming, I am of the opinion of, if you do not like something, you just don't need to consume it. If it's not for you, then let the people who it is for actually be entertained by it and experience it, versus just removing it from online platforms and not allowing anybody to actually download the game. And in my experience with Horses, nothing rises to the level of this being so problematic that it shouldn't be for sale. But the reality is, your experience with Horses is going to vary depending on your knowledge of classic film history, especially Italian cinema, because this definitely expects the player to have some foundational basis in what is actually trying to relay as far as the themes and content are concerned. Now, me with an MFA and 22 years experience, as well as being a college professor teaching film history, this is exactly so far right in the middle of my wheelhouse that I can basically pick it apart and probably do so for a dozen hours in a dozen different videos, but of course that's not what I'm going to do. But the problem is, I feel like the game developers here lean a little heavily on expecting their audience to actually understand what is being shown to you. When I teach college classes, I need to remind myself every day for the first day of class that my students do not know what I know. It is my job to take them along for the ride with me to make sure that what I am discussing is informative. And if you're wondering, that dog in the doghouse right there maybe might be something different than you would think. But I will say right now, this game absolutely deserves to exist, and the idea of censorship in gaming in 2025 drives me insane. Let's do a soundtrack sample so you can get a little bit more of the vibe, then we'll talk about a lot more when I come right back. Now, if you can't tell already, there you don't actually have any dialogue, you just have those interstitial titles explaining the story, which kind of puts us into the silent film era as far as the actual mechanics of what's going on here. And in the silent film era, you didn't really have any aspect ratio other than 4:3, which is basically where cinema kind of got its start, along with just a square aspect ratio. And yes, if you're wondering, we are using a human being in a horse mask right now to participate in a race. But the question is, why are we doing this, and what sort of actual message could be imparted from this gameplay? Now, if you've never seen the film before, and I am assuming 99 out of 100 of you haven't, about 50 out of 100 of you probably haven't even heard of it, Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom by Pasolini, is basically a study in how humanity can absolutely go wrong. It is a very difficult film to watch, but it is a very important film as well, and one that I will discuss and even show snippets from for my classes. It's basically an examination and explanation of how you can push in cinema and just how much you can quote-unquote get away with before you can actually turn the audience away from what you're trying to impart in a message. That is what Horses is doing here, and if it has a closest approximation, this is basically the video game version of Salo, except taking place more in an aesthetic of the silent film era versus kind of those 70s Italian films. And because this does take place in Italy, it is basically the counterpoint to something like Fellini's films, where you have this hyper-realized, almost cartoonish or circus-like Italy, where here you really have a character and case study of the labor market within Italy and just how downtrodden people truly could be. Kind of the idea of human beings as livestock and just how hard it is to get ahead in life. That is how deep this game goes, and I will say, if you have the foundational basis to understand that, there's absolutely so many different rich layers here. Even some of these mouth close-ups definitely don't involve cutting an eyeball, but there is a little bit of Uncin Andalou in here as well, a film that I absolutely will not teach my students because I do think it is one of the most overtaught things in the world. I was pestered by that film for basically my entire college career. I have seen it too many times, and I don't actually think it is all that good, even if it is all that important. But as far as what's going on in the world of Horses and this game, that is for you to suss out. I'm actually keeping this relatively spoiler-free because it is one of the most unique experiences I've had in gaming in probably like the last 5 or 10 years. And the fact that this thing is basically being banned all over the place is just not a just reality for a game like Horses. This is an important game that I do feel like people should experience just to understand how video games can be an art medium and can kind of get relatively close to the filmmaking process as well. I will say all of the imagery in Horses is very evocative of that Italian cinema I'm talking about, and it does have a very interesting look, feel, and vibe to it. It is like 10% janky around the edges, but the entire world here is kind of inexplicably unexplainable. You're never sure why any of this is truly happening. You're not even sure if this is a dream or a reality, because where in the real world would people dress up in horse masks and basically submit themselves to being livestock? Now, I'm sure that definitely does happen, not anything I've experienced in my life, but it is one of those things. Nothing in this game is outside the realm of possibility, and that might be why it's a little bit creepier. This is not unrealistic, it is just not likely. But we're going to move into our second soundtrack sample just so you can hear how strange this game gets, and I'll be right back. I mean, the music there is heightening the tension and trying to heighten your overall experience with Horses. It might be something that you absolutely love, it might be something that you absolutely hate, but it was absolutely a choice on the point of the developers to actually make something like that. Now, I just want you to be aware, though, if you do play this, the subject matter is all across the board. You might be somewhat invulnerable or really being bothered by anything, or there could be one topic out there that is something that you would actively avoid in your regular day-to-day existence as far as consuming media is concerned. So if you are interested in playing Horses, and there is something out there that would kind of be a touch point for you, to be something you do not enjoy, I would recommend looking up the subject matter just to make sure you can go through that list and decide for yourself is this something I actually want to play, and play is in air quotes even if you can't see it, or is this something that I would just generally avoid? But the idea there is, if you do not like something, you just don't have to experience it. That is something in 2025 that seems to be really bothering gaming. Games that are just getting removed from store platforms for some reason or another. Honestly, just don't consume it and you're perfectly fine. That is the reality here. And like I said, there definitely is some imagery here in horses that you're not quite sure why it exists. But I will say, as far as the contrasty black and white, it does evoke a more dreamlike image, and I think that was a very smart choice on the side of the developers to not actually put this game in color, because even though they're really calling back to a famous film of the Italian cinema 70s, this is something that I think works better in the aesthetic of the silent film era. Maybe they just didn't have voice actors and using the interstitials was the easiest way to do it, but the reality is I do think the lack of color here allows them to get away with a little bit more than you would otherwise get away with if you actually had a full color palette on offer. But as far as, again, why any of this is happening, that is up to your own interpretation, and that is generally something I love in video games. I don't want every single question answered for me, and in previous videos I've said whatever you imagine to be the reality is probably more impactful to you than the actual story on offer, because we use our imaginations to conjure up the things that affect us, that make us happy, that make us sad, and that make us fearful, and our own imagination is going to do a much more effective job of imparting those emotions than any sort of storyteller ever can, because nobody knows your brain better than you. You're inhabiting it right now as you actually listen to my voice. And I do think there is a little bit of a meta subplot here, because you, as this boy, show up to the farm to basically work as a farm hand. And the reality is the farmer here keeps asking you to do weirder and weirder tasks, things that most people, I would assume almost everyone, would be uncomfortable with. But yet you, the character in the game, and you, the player, continue along this pathway. This is basically a cinematic trope of seeing just how far humanity can be pushed before they break. And basically if everyone else around you thinks something is acceptable, then suddenly your overall moral compass will kind of be dropped down a little bit, which is definitely one of the central themes of Solo. And the filmmakers definitely use that in that film, and the developers here use that as well, because not only are you the character in the game, you're also the human being sitting behind the mouse and keyboard that is doing everything. They are taking you along for the ride, and they're seeing how far they can push you and how many things they can get you to do, because reality is, this is a game, this is not real life. What sort of inhibitions would you really actually have to drop to do these things? But that is kind of a really fun dual layer situation here, where you have both the character within the game being forced or coerced into these actions, and also you as the player deciding to freely do them of your own free will when you're actually just sitting around playing a video game. That kind of meta layer underneath is a hyper effective one, because after you finish this game you're going to think to yourself, why did I do that? But one more soundtrack sample and I'll be right back with just a little bit more horses. Now, if there's one thing, if the developers are listening, that they should definitely change, is using the white blob with black text to explain how to ride a horse takes you out of the immersion, because it should be done in the interstitial title style. But as far as the style and understanding of this game is concerned, I 100% understand that I have the ability to kind of see what this game is trying to do, and that's just because I have that education and background as 22 years as a filmmaker, cinematographer, and for the last some odd years, an educator in film and its history and production. But you don't don't have to have that to understand a lot of what horses are trying to do. And I don't want you to think that somehow I am quote-unquote better at understanding this just because of my history. You're probably better at 10 things that I am not at. But it's the reality of the situation. I do not know why this game is getting banned, even if I completely understand why certain storefronts are banning it. They just don't want to have the publicity, because in 2025, the easiest thing to do is just avoid a topic versus actually confronting it head on, because we seem to live in a world right now where people who don't like something just want to see it disappeared versus actually not wanting to consume it but leaving it open for others. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below, but we're done. A very different video, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.